Thanks for joining us tonight. My name is Bruce Director, for those of you who don't know, and we're joined tonight by Ian Overton of Houston, Texas. He's a graduate of the LaRouche youth movement, no longer a youth, but still younger. And he had the opportunity to spend a lot of time working with LaRouche in the effort to develop a cadre of citizens who understand, or who are researching and developing an understanding of some of the fundamental principles of science, economy, politics, and history on which the LaRouche movement is based, and on the ideas that Lyndon LaRouche developed. So he has a lot of experience and a lot of important ideas to present to us tonight. This will be the first of a two-part series. And what Ian has in store for us is to dig into the fundamental questions that American citizens really have to grapple with in order to be able to steer this country back into a direction that is consistent with an expanding future for our citizens and also for mankind, as LaRouche defined it. Now, of course, everything's been heating up politically over the last couple of weeks, in addition to inflation heating up, which is already wreaking havoc in the economy. And people are feeling the pinch, and Biden seems to be compelled to at least acknowledge now that the transitory nature that Powell and Biden and all the so-called economists have promised us about inflation is not transitory at all, unless you want to consider transitory to be forever. But you see, it's way out of control. And, let me just interject here, as LaRouche often demonstrated in his work on economics, that inflation is not caused by massive government spending, although the massive government spending that the Biden collective has been pushing and is proposing to push is certainly going to accelerate inflation. But the inflation crisis and the economic crisis we're in right now has been long in the making, and largely due to globalization and a consistent policy since at least August 15th, 1971, but actually before that as well, for a policy of reducing the productive powers of labor, deindustrializing the industrial economies, and relying on ever increasingly cheaper forms of labor and looting to maintain a huge financial bubble. And over the last 50 years or so, you've seen these bubbles come and go, expand and blow up. And each time it's had a complete disastrous effect. There were a couple times in our history when that wasn't the case, when we had government spending as well as a lot of private sector spending into investments in technologies, capital investments like the space program, or the spinoffs of the SDI program under Reagan, the space program under Kennedy, the SDI program under Reagan, or what was beginning to happen under Trump with the Artemis program, the emphasis on nuclear power and other manufacturing and so forth, and the effort to try and reshore industrial production in the United States and unwind the disastrous entanglement in globalization or the modern British Empire that we had gotten into. Now we're in a fight to regain that momentum. And in the Q&A, we can take up more of the specifics about that in terms of what's happening in the actual political back and forth that's going on, of which you can read a lot about on the LaRouche PAC website. But what's important is not that you simply know what's going on in the political ups and downs and turns and twists that are happening in the news every day, but what are the principles that American citizens really have to be rallied around? What are the things that a competent citizen really needs to know. What are the principles they need to know in order to instruct their fellow citizens and to bring forth a leadership that can actually shift the policies of the country. Clearly, President Trump has made it very clear that he plans to lead a fight in this direction. And as he said before in his speech before Mar-a-Lago at the America First Policy Institute fundraiser, that it takes courage to do this, and we're not going to back down. Americans are not going to give up their country. We're not going to submit to the complete destruction of the United States, the direction we were on under Bush, Obama, and for many years before that. But that we're going to fight to make sure and win this fight to re-Americanize the U.S. economy. But if we're going to be successful in doing that, people really need to understand the basic principles that LaRouche emphasized are at the root of all real economics, which has nothing to do really with money and statistics, but has to do with the fundamental nature of man. So Ian has 2 classes prepared for us to try and get you interested in these ideas. And we're going to begin the first one right now.
Thanks, Bruce. Really appreciate it. Yes, I've been watching these classes for a long time. This is my first time presenting one in this format. Many of you probably know me indirectly through my wife, Keisha Rogers, who is a regular face on these programs. And today, I want to take up a subject that in auditing many of these conversations that we've had over the last 2 years, I've noticed something that I thought was a little disturbing that could be improved upon. And that is expressed in a certain comment that I heard several weeks ago during the Q&A period, where one very well-meaning and very passionate young man had said something to the effect of, well, we have to accept the fact that we're not scientists here. And as a result, we can't actually know certain things about what needs to be done. And as a result of that, we're operating off of our feelings about it effectively. Things we may feel are true opinions and are correct and may actually work, but nonetheless are true opinions and our feelings. And I took issue with that, and I thought about it, and I said, I think it'd be very important to present some ideas that were core concepts that I had the good fortune of living with during the time of the LaRouche Youth Movement, and really coming to know in a direct way through many hours of rigorous study of original works, which was a big emphasis of what we talked about. And when I would go out and I would organize in the population, and I would, whether it was a table organizing and where many people may have met our movement, or networking, or other types of rally environments and things like that, where we meet people and bring them into these sorts of conversations, I would inevitably come up with something that would happen where a person would say to me, well, all these great ideas that you're talking about sound wonderful, but here's why they can't happen, because you haven't seen this movie or this documentary or read this book about this particular thing, which is really, really bad. And that's because you don't know about this thing. You haven't read this thing, which is really, really bad. The really good things that we're talking about, which sound great, they can't happen yet. Whether that was someone trying to tell me about the Federal Reserve, or they're trying to talk about some power structure, or they're trying to talk about whatever it is they were trying to tell me. And I came up with a metaphor for that, which I called haunted house syndrome. And people who are stuck in a haunted house and don't know how to get out, and they don't know how to free themselves from the terror of that haunted house. And I'll tell you, a good way to conceptualize that today, because it's in the news and it's very timely, is the tragedy at the Astroworld concert that Travis Scott and others were rapping at. And so I decided to call this class series Escape from Astroworld, because what Astroworld represents, and I'm not getting into things like whether, we'll talk about music in a moment, but I'm not really trying to talk about the technical details of the tragedy per se. For those who aren't familiar, be honest, the thumbnail, he comes on stage, the crowd swells, and 9 people are crushed to death, and it was horrible. But the real Astroworld is what I mentioned with the haunted house issue, that here we are stuck in a tragedy where we're being squeezed and people don't know necessarily how to get out. And people are dying from these policies of the Biden administration and the people who are above that, and need to find a way to get out of that problem. And when we have a conversation about that, oftentimes, not every time, but many times I've found that, again, I find this response of these are great ideas, but whatever. And I think if we're going to be a little bit more historically precise, we want to talk about this problem and how to get people not to be apathetic about big, bold, beautiful ideas and policies that will not just reverse the problems that we've been facing and experiencing in my entire lifetime or Bruce's entire lifetime, but actually move beyond those sorts of limitations to brand new, amazing adventures in society, like going back to the moon and then going on to Mars, like dealing with and ending the problems of famine in the world or in our own country. If we're going to have big, audacious solutions, then we're going to have to inspire people, and then people are going to have to examine their own internal reasons why they're choosing not to be inspired. And one of the things that I'm going to be going through today is I hope will help people get out of that. A good historical way to think about Astroworld or the haunted house syndrome is to go back to the allegory of the cave, which is a story that Plato tells in his Republic, where he describes a situation where people are chained inside of a cave and they are looking at a wall. And across the wall are shadows. And these shadows are being cast from people who are standing behind the viewers. And there's a fire behind them, and they're broadcasting this as you would like a shadow puppet theater. And in this dialogue, Socrates is discussing what would happen if you were to unchain someone from this cave and take them out so that they could see how the things that they were looking at that they thought were true were really just shadows and projections on the wall. Okay, how do we get them out of that cave so that they can come and see the true daylight, and then inspire them to go back into the cave to then help free other people? And that's what we're really trying to do. We're trying to get people in these conversations to make a breakthrough, okay, and that breaking free from certain ideological chains that are keeping you in a position of apathy towards solutions. And I think it's apt to point out that that apathy is in fact engineered, and you can know the historical basis of that engineering, and I'm going to go through some of that today. But my point here, as I go through some of these different things that I'm going to discuss, is I want to caution people. I want to caution people not to get overly focused and fixated on the specific things that, in fact, I'm giving as examples, because my overarch that I'm aiming for, which is going to be completed in the second class, so come back and stay tuned for that, is broader than the specific examples that I'm bringing up. So This class here today, this conversation is going to focus primarily on questions of culture, okay? And the next class, the following week, is going to focus more on the questions of science. However, as you'll see, they're going to interplay and interweave together quite a bit. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to introduce you to a character. And this character, his name is Theodore Adorno. So I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, so as you can see here, I have a screenshot of Travis Scott. He's wearing a shirt that says "Put on a happy face," and it has a picture of the planet with a screw through it. This is not from the Astroworld concert. This is actually an earlier photo. And on the right-hand side, you can see a photograph of Theodore Adorno. Now, a little bit about this man, Theodore Adorno. He lived in Germany. He was a philosopher, a musician during the time of the early 1920s. And he developed, he left Germany during World War II because he was Jewish and was being persecuted, went to the United States, and then eventually came back to Germany after World War II and became a leading philosopher and commentator in what became known as the Frankfurt School, which was a school of thought organized by people like Max Horkheimer and Herbert Marcuse and Hannah Arendt and a few others. And his focus was on music, okay? The Frankfurt School and Theodore Adorno specifically were proponents and developers of a theory. They called it critical theory, which is a precursor to what is today popularly known as critical race theory. These were a group of dedicated Marxists who loved Marx and Sigmund Freud and other philosophers around that time, and they were arguing against a different school of philosophical thought, which I'll talk more about in next week's class, organized around Vienna. They were specifically against what was called positivism, and in the critical theory, they broke with classic Marxism, which said that the tools of oppression that keep society enslaved is industrial and economic, and went with the idea, well, no, it's actually systemic and cultural. And that's where this idea of systemic racism and systemic oppression actually originates historically in the modern sense. It originates from the Frankfurt School, and it originates from this white guy, which is, of course, ironic if you think about the people who are talking about critical race theory today is the problem are white guys. But the irony notwithstanding, and whatever, don't get too focused on that. He develops a critique of Western civilization, and that's pretty much what critical theory does. Is it tries to find the problems with everything, and it doesn't really actually offer solutions to anything. But he wrote a book, and it's called The Philosophy of New Music, which is written in 1946 in German, and then it was translated in the 70s to Philosophy on Modern Music. And when I first, be honest, when I was going to college in the early 2000s after 9/11 as a young man, I was very concerned with the direction that the world was going in. 9/11, it seemed like it was a setup for war that didn't need to necessarily happen. And I was very concerned about the attacks on civil liberties by the Bush and Cheney administration and the Patriot Act and things like that. And so I personally became very interested in and formed in my area of study before things like social justice warrior were words and concepts. That's what I was studying. So when I found that the music that I thought was providing me with insights, the rap and the techno and the heavy metal and all the different music that was there trying to tell you about, hey, wake up, there's a system of slavery and it's keeping you in chains and you better watch out, that this was and is a form of that very same slavery that they were talking about and supposedly warning me to wake up from. And it was developed, and the philosophy for this was developed by the Frankfurt School. And so here on the screen, you can see what, in his own words, Theodore Adorno talks about as goals of modern music. Not just the top 40 pop smash hits either. You find when you start to look into some of this stuff that really all modern music is pretty much the same. I mean, regardless of the lyrics. He says, quote, modern music sees absolute oblivion as its goal. It is the surviving message of despair from the shipwrecked. He talks about how it's not that schizophrenia is directly expressed therein, like it's not people singing going blah, 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 although if you think about some of the heavy metal, they sure are. But the music itself imprints upon itself an attitude similar to that of the mentally ill. And in so doing, it would hope to mitigate insanity as true health. The authoritarian character of today is, without exception, conformist. In the final analysis, this music tends to become the style for everyone because it coincides with the man in the street style. And he describes these as the intentions. And if you're familiar with these things, it's very clear. I mean, all these different musical genres, they have their own uniforms that people wear. It's really kind of funny, but he continues on though. He talks about specific ways that that conformity of authoritarianism in the supposed absence of authoritarianism manifests. And he talks about specific goals that modern music has. One of these is depersonalization, which is the loss of connection to one's own body. He uses the word hebephrenia to describe a person being indifferent to their own sickness and indifferent to that which is external to them. Catatonia, a similar behavior is found in people who are overwhelmed by shock or PTSD. And necrophilia. He says, Theodore Adorno says, that universal necrophilia is the last perversity of style. And if you're looking at the screen and you can see the screen, the photo here is a photo directly from the Astroworld concert where the 9 people were crushed to death. You know, if you look at this actual content of Travis Scott and his music, the sexuality, the drug use, the violence, I mean, it's all there, but that's not really the point here, right? What we're looking at is, you know, being stuck in Astroworld, right? When we're stuck in a situation like this, because we're looking at these kinds of goals, whether the music is country music or pop dance music or electronic music or hip hop and rap or metal or all these different types of, you know, classic rock and all these things, what we're looking at is we're looking at a situation where we're the music, the every man on the street, the conformity is generating an indifference to one's own suffering, an indifference to solutions, an indifference to, if you're in a burning theater and you're like, hey, how do I get out of here? And they say, oh yeah, go this way. Oh, you know, well, what difference does it make? You know, we're all gonna die anyway. And you probably encounter this if you're out there organizing and out there trying to recruit people to profound ideas, right? So it's a real problem. It's a cultural chain presenting itself. If you look at some of the different types of musicians that are out there parading around as musicians, presenting itself as a form of liberation from oppression. And this generates, if you look at these sorts of problems and you think to yourself, well, I don't accept that. I don't accept this treatment of me. I don't want to be taken this way. I don't want corrupt people in positions of power to enforce arbitrary rules on us, like you know, all white men are you know, worse than Al Qaeda and some of the other crap that you hear coming out of the media these days. I don't accept critical race theory. I don't accept some of these things. But what do we fall back on? What do we actually have as a culture, which is good, which is positive on its own terms, not just in reaction to bad things, right? And if we're working on developing things like that within ourselves, until we have actually been able to come out of that cave, to escape from Astroworld and experience through the power of our own intellectual faculties a true discovery, to say, wow, this is actually true. I've proven it. It reflects a principle that is lawful universally. Until we've been able to experience that kind of discovery ourselves, then we are in fact existentialists. Even if we don't think necessarily that we are, there is a quality of existentialism in the process of trying to figure out how to get out of that cave, how to get out of that Astroworld. And so what I'd like to do here for the remainder of my opening remarks is I'd like to actually share with you some experimental work that can help you break free of Astroworld. Okay. And so the first one that I'm going to talk about is we're just going to simply destroy sense perception, sense certainty as a way of figuring out what's true. When you look at the world today, there's a common phrase which says that seeing is believing, right? Well, I saw it with my own eyes. I know it's true. Well, most of us at least will understand maybe intellectually that, well, okay, there's a whole world outside of what we can see. There's ultraviolet light or infrared light or X-ray light, all these kinds of things. But one of the things that I find is just fun is being able to get out of that. And so I'm going to share with you my next slide here. Now, if you're looking at my screen, you'll see on the left-hand side, you'll see a little plus sign. And on the right-hand side, you're going to see a plus sign with a little circle around it. Okay. And if you're just on the telephone and you're not actually watching this on a video on Zoom, what I encourage you to do is find a blank piece of paper. It could be, a regular printer paper or whatever, and more or less replicate this. You can take if you divide your paper in half, you take and you make a little dot in the middle of the second half. So it kind of looks like that, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to do a little test. It's called, did you know you have a blind spot in your eye test? Destroying the belief that seeing is believing. So what I'm going to ask you to do, I'm going to ask you to cover your right eye, and I'm going to ask you to look with your left eye at the circle and plus sign. And I am looking at this, and I'm sitting about, I don't know, maybe 1.5 feet, 2 feet away from my computer screen. And what you'll notice, whether you're holding up a piece of paper, and if you're holding up a piece of paper, then you look on the other half of the page where the dot is not drawn. Cover your right eye, look with your left eye. And what you'll see is that if you look at the icon on the left, this plus sign with the circle around it, in this way, at these angles, that the plus sign by itself on the left-hand side of the screen simply disappears. It fades into the background. Why does it do that? Well, it does that because in your eyeball, you have an optic nerve, and the part of your eye where the optic nerve interfaces with your retina, there's no light receptors there. Okay, so what happens is that your brain, because you have three-dimensional vision from two eyes that are offset, what your brain does is your brain actually fills in these gaps. And so what we're doing with this experiment, by covering our eye and looking at one of the covering your right eye, looking at the one on the right, covering your left eye, looking at the one on the left, is you're isolating at the exact angle where that blind spot is in your eye. And this is I like this little experiment because what it does is it disproves the belief that reality is what you see. So when we realize this, it helps us to break out of the shadows that are cast against the wall of our sense perceptions, the shadows that are broadcast to us in the 24-hour media cycle, the shadows that are talked about all over the place, where people are saying, this is real, we've seen it, this is real, and the people are bombarding us with all this stuff. It's a simple test to say, okay, maybe everything that I'm seeing is not real. Maybe my brain, maybe things are filling that in. How do we stop grasping at these shadows? How do we come to identify and examine and test hypotheses that give rise to the highly emotional convictions that many of us have around subjects like political change or human nature or monotheism or love or economics or what's true or what will work or what we should do about what we need to do? And it's not a coincidence that the allegory of the cave, Socrates also provides a method, the Socratic method. This is a method of questioning. It's a method of questioning to examine internally the approaches that you are bringing to the table. And we talk about this as sort of three levels. You have a hypothesis. You say, this is true. I think this is the case. This is my definition of virtue or my definition of what we should do about things. And what Socrates will do is he'll start to get you to ask. He'll turn around questions. Well, you have made a diagnosis here, but are you a doctor? Well, how do we actually get it? And he starts to ask you questions where people start to have to explain and figure out where in their thinking is there actually a contradiction. But then there's a higher level of this. We call this the higher hypothesis. So instead of you're making a hypothesis saying this is true, what we're actually starting to do now is just saying, well, why did I make that hypothesis? And we can take it actually one step further. We can say, well, how do I think about the way that I'm thinking about hypothesizing? Gottfried Leibniz took this in a certain way, and he said, ask yourself the question, well, why should it be this way and not otherwise? How do we get, by examining the approach through which we're coming up with the ideas that we're thinking about for reality, how do we start to distill them down to their essential ideas? What Leibniz would call a monad. And in this sense, and with my way I'm talking about it, is an idea which has no other assumptions built into it. It's a really simple testable hypothesis. Kepler dealt with this. Johannes Kepler dealt with this when he was looking at the orbits of the planets. And he was able to identify a specific assumption that he had made, that the planetary orbits were circles, right? And by being able to identify a very specific concept, he was able to come up with ways to isolate and test for the validity of his idea. And what I find to be really fun, and what I'm going to go through here in a moment, is it's when we start to look at how to play with ideas, and once we've figured out what an idea actually is, something that we can start to test and play around with, and we'll get to that some more, and then we can talk about it more in the question and answer period, is how do different ideas actually work together? And a great way to do that is actually through music. So, okay. So in a little bit here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to play from a piece from Mozart. We've never really played a video through one of these conversations before, but so what I've done is I've taken the sheet music and I have highlighted the four musical ideas that Mozart presents in this piece. And I've highlighted them in different colors. And so and then I've put the sheet music over the video so you can kind of follow and see how Mozart is playing with these different ideas by trying to condense them down from their original form to an even more dense form, to stretch them out, to layer them against each other, to invert one and flop it on top of the other one the other direction, to have different ideas simultaneously, or to trade them across the soprano, alto, tenor, and bass line and piano line as it is in the music. And it's this, what I want, the purpose of this is not to get into an in-depth conversation about Mozart. What it really is for is to get into a conversation about ideas and the playing with ideas and sharing around of ideas as we start to look at, well, what are the effect of ideas when they're combined? What is the result of all these different ideas that can move me, that can cause people to become inspired? So just to summarize those here in this particular piece, which is the Laudate Pueri from Mozart's Vespers, there's four basic musical ideas. And I'm going to sing them for you. Dee da 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 da. That's one of them. That's a main one. He also has a downward scale. Dee 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 dee. And then he has two minor ideas which pop up in various ways. And the main one is in red. The downward scale is in green. The other one is the blue one, which is da 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 da. And that's a variant on the downward scale. And then we have the golden one, which is dee da 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 da. Right. So just a note when I get ready to share this, a few things. Number one, this was from my wedding 10 years ago. And it was from my wedding. And so there's no piano accompaniment. I do own the rights to this video. There is a little bit of background noise. The singers are not professionals, so I just apologize for that stuff in advance. But what I encourage you to do as you are watching this is try to pick maybe a specific color and follow that color as it crosses different voice lines, or pick a specific and look at how that color might be developing and changing. I'm not going to say this is perfect or comprehensive, but I just wanted to introduce this as a conversation piece, which we can take up in the Q&A. So without further ado, here we go. Okay, I'm hitting you with some geometry. And what I'm going to talk about now is I'm going to shift from Mozart to the astronomer, astrophysicist, really, Johannes Kepler. Because what Kepler was able to do is he was able to provide a physical basis for constructing music that had not been developed previously. And then he was able to apply that to astronomy in a way which is utterly incredible and profound. And so what I'm showing you here, I'm going to break this down and then go through this one step at a time. But on the left, I have a circle, and within inside that circle, I've divided it in multiple ways by putting regular figures drawn inside of that circle. There's a diameter, there's a triangle, a square, a pentagon, a hexagon, and an octagon. And the basis of this geometry and the importance of this point is that regardless of whatever size your circle is to begin with, every figure that's drawn here within this circle can be drawn in a noble way as constructed from the starting diameter. And I'm not going to go in and demonstrate that right now, but that is because there's a lot to that, a lot of math to that, and that's not really the point of what I'm trying to get at. What I'm trying to get at is that when it comes to something like the music, that from which we're creating our ideas in Mozart, those notes are not arbitrary. They're not just noises. They're not just sounds. They're not modern sounds, like the way Theodore Adorno talks about modern music and its sounds. They are physically constructed. So I'm going to show this here. If we start with a circle, and let's say the circle itself, the outside perimeter of this circle, is a string on a cello. If we were to take this string and we were to actually loop it in a circle, and we start to divide that circle according to those shapes that I had shown you, we find that half of a circle is an octave of the whole string. It's double the pitch. We take a triangle, we've drawn a regular triangle inside of that. If we take 2/3 of that, it forms what's called a fifth in relation to the whole original string. If we take a square and we draw a regular square where all four corners are touching the diameter of the circle, 3/4 of that is a fourth. A pentagon, same thing. All 5 corners are touching the perimeter of the circle. We take 3 of those, it's a minor third. And we take 4 of those, it's a minor sixth. Again, if we took that length of string and plucked it in relation to the entire string. For a hexagon, 5/6 is a major sixth division. And for an octagon, 5/8 is a major third here. So here we have our, I guess I'm covering up my own screen with my face. So here we have those, again, as I showed you before, now presented together. And what Kepler does is he puts those, there we go. He arranges those on a scale. He calls them the hard mode and the soft mode. But today we call those the major and the minor modes. And he shows the basic divisions by which one goes up a scale, the major mode and the minor mode. And that those notes correspond to those divisions geometrically that were constructed from us on the string. And this is actually the basis by which music is generated. Now, there is a lot of other details that I'm obviously skipping over for the point of time here, including how those notes are tuned. And once you go beyond a single octave, how it becomes there's different things that have to change, and the divisions are not so exactly precise that way, but that's not the point. This is not a class on music itself. We're looking at this is a conversation about the playing around with ideas. So, but just to, I presented this to you to give you a basis of where we're going next, because as Keats says on his Ode of a Grecian Urn, it's the heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. What Kepler does after taking these harmonies is he applies them to his work in astrophysics. So I'm going to give you a brief background real fast so that we can be on the same page as this, okay? Kepler was the first person to prove that the orbits of the planets are elliptical. He was the first person to prove that they orbit the sun and that they don't orbit the Earth, for example, or orbit random circles that are drawn on pieces of paper. And he described that the basis for this motion around the sun is magnetic. He was able to demonstrate that the planets, as they are sweeping out their orbits, they speed up as they get closer to the sun, and they slow down as they get further away from the sun. And those 2 points in an orbit are called the perihelion, which is near the sun or closest to it, and the aphelion, which is the furthest from the sun or farthest from it. Okay. And the arcs that they travel in a daily, let's say a day's motion, are equal in area. So the two, I mean, this, I just draw this for illustrative purposes, but in the physical world, those 2 triangles that you see on my screen would have equal areas. All right. Now, what he does is he takes this concept and he looks for the musical harmonies. And the way he does that is, instead of tracking the physical motions of the planets, he pretends that he's standing on the sun. And if he was on the sun, I put little sunglasses there so you can see that the sun is now looking at the solar system. If you're looking on the computer. The motions as they would appear to an observer on the sun at the various those fastest and slowest points, the amount of arc that they would travel in a day, let's say, what the ratio between those types of apparent motions are correspond with musical harmonies. That the planets, as observed by the sun, not necessarily how they move physically, but how they're observed moving, that the ratios are the same ratios that were found in the construction of musical harmonies. And here you have an idea where you're looking at motions that you can't see with your eyes, and you're playing them against sounds you can't hear with your ears. And Kepler did this, and Kepler was able to develop from this method of plotting, forecasting the positions of planets. He was able to develop the most accurate star chart that had ever been developed at the time in 1627, called the Rudolphine Tables, which was highly prized throughout the entire world as the way to successfully navigate and anticipate stars, which is very important if you're traveling in the oceans, which the main method of transportation was ships, where there's no geographical landmarks. So the only way you can really travel is by astronomy. And so that's the essence of it. I want to recap and tell you why, again, I was showing you musical examples, why I was showing you astronomical examples. Because the point that I've been trying to make this entire time, and what I hope you were going to take away from this concept, is if we want to free ourselves from the nightmare of the world's, all the bad stuff that's going on, we're going to have to develop within us real ideas, true ideas, ideas that are reflective of the physical universe, ideas that empower us and inspire us because we can prove they're true. They're not just my opinion. They're not just your opinion. They don't just make us feel good. But not only do they inspire us because it's just awesome. Like, my God, the music that I might play on a cello is reflected in the motions of the planets, and you can know that. It means you're not a beast. You're not some chattel slave that the corporations and the governments of the world can just, piss on and use as they see fit. You have a soul, you have dignity, and you're going to stand up for that because, my God, we have this kind of universe in which we're living. And so I think that's how we're going to find ourselves impassioned and empowered to actually also push policies that can make a difference in the world, policies that we can know in advance of implementing them that they'll work, that they will effectively stop this British Empire, that they will effectively launch a renaissance in human thinking and relationships. So that's what I wanted to go through, and I appreciate everyone's time, and I look forward to having a conversation with you about it.